In this video review, we're going to look at the bones and surface markings of the cranium and the facial bones. Show you several different views. Again, you'll review this and then you need to practice on the practice test, and you also need to fill out the worksheets. So here we have a lateral view of the skull. So we're going to start anteriorly, and here you're looking at the frontal bone. Down here is your cheekbone, your zygomatic bone. Up here is the parietal bone. And in the back posteriorly is the occipital bone. You can see the foramen magnum, which is part of the occipital bone. What's not marked here, but you can also kind of see, is the occipital condyles. And way back here, this little bump, which I'll show you on another slide, is the occipital protuberance. Then we head to the temporal bone, which is right here. And it has several surface markings that you're going to need to be familiar with. So first, temporal bone is the whole bone. Then we have the mastoid process, which, if you remember, if you think about your ear being right here, the mastoid process is right behind your ear. You can actually feel that. You can feel the mastoid process using your two fingers behind your ear. The little hole here, which is part of your ear, is called the external auditory meatus. And then you have this last pointy structure, which is the styloid process. So again, these are all surface markings of the temporal bone. So a common question would be, if this part was marked, it would say, this is what surface marking of what bone. The surface marking would be the mastoid process, and it would be of the temporal bone. So again, frontal, zygomatic, parietal, occipital. You can see the foramen magnum, the occipital condyles, the occipital protuberance, temporal, external auditory meatus, styloid process, and the mastoid process. Still, we have a lateral view, but we're looking a little more towards the anterior portion of the skull. You have the frontal bone, you have the nasal bone, you have the lacrimal bone, if you remember, is on the inside of the orbit of the eye. Zygomatic bone, maxillary or maxilla is A. Again, we come back to the temporal bone. You can still see the external auditory meatus, and here you get almost a better view of the styloid process. Frontal bone, nasal bone, lacrimal bone, zygomatic, maxilla or maxillary, temporal with the external auditory meatus, and the styloid process. Now we're looking at an anterior view of the skull. Here we have the frontal bone. You can see the nasal bones up here fused, zygomatic bone, maxilla or maxillary, and the mandible. Again, frontal, nasal, zygomatic, maxilla or maxillary, and mandible. Now we're looking at an inferior view of the skull, so looking at the underparts of the skull and what bones you could see there. Here again you have the temporal bone. You can see the mandibular fossa, and you can see the mastoid process of the temporal bone. You can see them on both sides. Then we have the occipital bone. You have your foramen magnum. These smooth surfaces on the lateral portions of the foramen magnum are the occipital condyles. And in the posterior aspect of the occipital bone, and you can feel this with your fingers, is the occipital protuberance. Temporal bone, surface markings of the temporal bone, mandibular fossa, mastoid process. Occipital bone, foramen magnum, occipital condyle, occipital protuberance. Now we're looking underneath the teeth, and you don't need to know all of these. The one I want to show you, two I want to show you. First of all, this is part of the maxilla or maxillary. This is the top of your mouth, the hard, what's called the hard palate. That is this first 2/3. Here are your teeth. The first 2/3 are the maxilla or maxillary bone. And then here you have what's called the palatine bone. So it's posterior in the mouth, and it makes up a section of your hard palate. Now we're looking into the skull. We're looking into the skull. Anteriorly, we have the frontal bone. Bisecting that is the ethmoid bone. This bone right here is called the sphenoid bone. Looks like a butterfly. In the center of that sphenoid bone is what's called the sella turcica. That's a surface marking for the sphenoid bone. In that will sit your pituitary gland from your brain. Here we can see the temporal bones on the lateral portion, and again in the back is the occipital bone with the foramen magnum right here. Frontal, ethmoid, sphenoid, sella turcica, temporal, occipital, and the foramen magnum. Those are all the bones and all the surface markings that you're responsible for the face and the cranium. Again, review, practice spelling them with the worksheets, and then also take the practice test.